Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and welcome back to another unit roster overview, as we'll be taking a look at the Tzeentch roster today. Now, with only 14 units, the Tzeentch roster is tied with Nurgle roster for having the fewest number of units, but interestingly enough, of the 4 Chaos Gods, Tzeentch actually has the most diversity in terms of the types of units that he has, and as you can see here, there are 6 categories for the 14 units, including infantry, missile infantry, cavalry and chariots, missile cavalry and chariots, monster and beasts, and finally missile monster beasts. And even though you don't have many choices within each of these categories, the Tzeentch roster overall does offer a bit of everything, and thus provides some additional flexibility in battle. So getting things started, we have the Blue Horrors of Tzeentch, which also happens to be the cheapest unit in the Tzeentch roster at 400 cost. Now these are technically melee infantry, but they do have a range component. As you can see, they have 5 ammo with limited range of 90, and missile strength is quite weak because most of the damage is going to be base, 13 and 2 split, with 7.2 second reload time, which is decently fast. And basically you just want to charge these guys in, and as they charge, they will fire off these flaming missiles, little spells that does fire damage, which reduce enemy healing by half, and if they're vulnerable to fire, then they will do additional damage to them, and it's considered a magical attack. And once they get up close, they're going to dish out a very similar set of damage that is going to be also magic and flaming, even though the little dagger is not technically on fire, which is interesting. The weapon strength is going to have the same issue of low armor piercing damage, and that's really their weakness. They're sort of your fodder units to throw into the combat, almost no armor, and pretty low leadership at below 50 at 45 base. Speed is not super high, and melee attack and melee defense are both quite low. And one unique thing about Tzeentch unit is they're all going to have this thing called barrier, which you can see here being at 1400, and this can be replenished in battle when you're not taking any sort of damage. But once you lose your barrier, you start losing your health, and you can still recover barrier, but you can't recover all of it. Part of it will be based on how much remaining health you have. So let's say if we drop below to 3,840 or half health, then we'll only get 700 of our barrier back. So it's proportional to our remaining health on the unit. So it's best to micro these units in and out of combat so you can have full advantage of this replenishing barrier all time. I do believe spells will bypass the barrier. So this is not going to protect you from spells being spammed onto the field, because I had instances where while playing the campaign, a spell would just bypass the barrier and damage the unit, through their health. So it's not perfect against everything, but it will help to keep your units alive with bonus health that is able to replenish. Now, in terms of abilities, these are demonic units, so they will have all the demonic traits, which means if they are broken or shattered, they will start killing themselves as they get banished back into the Chaos Realms. They can hide, they cause fear, and most Tzeentch units will have a 20% physical resistance to help bolster their defenses. Then moving on to a more premium infantry option, we have the Forsakens of Tzeentch, which costs 850. And if we take a look here, we get 80 units per retinue here, much more mass at 230. And they're going to be also armored with the barrier, as well as having high armor here, 85 points. Good leadership, definitely a much more premium infantry option. They're considered sword infantry, but really they are using claws here. And their weapon strength is pretty decent, 44-14. Most of it is still base, but it is magical attack, so that does help bypass physical resistances. There's not too much to say about the stats. They're just pretty decent for infantry option overall. And in terms of abilities, they're no longer demons, so we don't have the penalty of being shattered or broken, but we do have Frenzy, which is seen on some core units before, where basically if you can maintain high leadership, you get bonuses to your damage, charge bonus, melee attack, and immune to psychology, which does not really matter for us because we have immune to psychology by default. This is just a default skill of Frenzy shared by a bunch of chaos units, so there's no point to actually just remove that for them. A little bit of duplication never hurt anyone. These units will have spell resistance of 40% instead of physical resistance, as they have pretty decent physical resistance with their high armor stats. As you can see, while their leadership is above 35, which is their base, they will enjoy 8 point of bonus for their melee attack, boosting this to 40. Their damage is still considered magical damage, so they will also bypass enemy physical resistances, and overall, a pretty decent unit here for the Tzeentch roster. Moving on to the missile infantries, we start with the Pink Horror of Tzeentch costing at 700 cost. Now, unlike their blue cousins, these are going to be mainly range focused. They come with half the number per retinue at 80, and they have a mass of 100, which is slightly higher. Their main difference is they have 20 ammo, so they're mainly focused for range, and their damage is going to be higher as well across the board. So 15.5 for the split for the missile damage, 7.2 second reload, that's the same. Their weapon strength is also higher than the blue version. Makes sense, they cost a bit more. In terms of abilities, they have the same setup: Demonic, Hide, Cause Fear, 20% physical resistance. So they're going to be the slightly more premium option for horrors, mainly going to keep them back for the range. But if they do get into melee, they'll do pretty well, better than blue horrors actually. But blue horrors has the advantage of being cheaper, and you get 2 times as many of them per retinue, even though across the board stat is lower, including a much lower leadership, which might matter quite a bit, given that these are demon units that can kill themselves when they're shattered or broken. Then moving up to 1100 cost, we have the premium range unit, which is the Exalted Pink Horrors of Tzeentch. The main visual difference is these have horns. They're going to be a tier 3 infantry with slightly more mass. The horns worth 30, I guess. And it's going to be 80 per retinue as well. They have the same 20 ammo, but if you look at their missile strength, it's a bit stronger. 17.7 versus 15.5. Same reload speed, same type of weapon composition with flaming and magic attack. And melee, it's going to have slightly better stats across the board as well. Weapon strength is going to be 22 and 10. So once again, these Pink Horrors are going to be pretty decent in melee combat as well, but their main focus is going to be their range component, since they have more range, more ammo, and more damage as well. In terms of abilities, we get one additional one compared to the standard demon setup and the same 20% physical resistance. We have Arcane Mirth, and this is going to help with the Winds of Magic with a 20% power recharge when these units are outside of combat, just giving you a little bit additional magic help. And other than that, not much to say, as we're going to round up our regular missile infantry for the Tzeentch roster. Then moving on to Cavalry and Chariots, we have the Chaos Knights of Tzeentch at 1450. Quite pricey for a unit, but these are obviously cavalry units. They're considered heavy shot cavalry, I guess, with their high armor and the shield that blocks 30% of all small arm missile fires from the front. They're 60 per retinue with 1130 mass, which is pretty similar to most human factions, I guess, in terms of the cavalry units. And their main thing is they have decent stats across the board, but they have a very weird barrier setup where it's only 800. All the horror units and basic infantry units we've seen earlier have at least 1400 barrier, even though they have even less hit points. These tend to have more hit points and less barrier. Like the Exalted Pink Horrors we just saw had 1800 barrier. So these are going to function more or less like regular units because the barrier is lower. So there's less microing perhaps, even though these are cavalry, so they tend to be more mobile. Their speed of 66 pretty much put them on par with all the other heavy cavalries I've seen for other factions, whether it's Grand Cathay or Kislev. So this is pretty much a heavy armored cavalry speed in the game. And then weapon damage, 46, not too high, not too low, 32-14 distribution here. And the charge bonus is decent. So everything pretty much averages out. They say this unit is anti-infantry, but technically you don't have any bonus damage. You're just going to be charging at a massive infantry, and you do slightly better then. And that's about it. In terms of abilities, nothing fancy as well. We have just Cause Fear and Hide. Then taking to the skies, we have the Doom Knights of Tzeentch at 1600 cost. And obviously these are flying cavalry. They ride sort of this disc instead of a horse. Thus they have slightly less armor because of that. That's my opinion here. In terms of the shield, it's a better shield here at 55%. It does look bigger, considering that you're now standing instead of sitting on a horse. There are only 24 units per retinue here. Their mass is also slightly less without the mass of the horse at 800. These units are going to be fast, much faster at 105. Decent leadership, pretty average stats across the board. A little bit stronger weapon strength here, 56-24 split, and a little bit higher charge bonus. No special abilities aside from Vanguard deployment and can fly, and they also can cause fear. So pretty similar to the Knights we saw earlier. These are just going to take the air here. Now the Tzeentch roster is going to have a lot of area units, so this is no surprise here. And once again, much like the Knight, we have a very low barrier. So you can almost treat these units as regular units because a percentage of their health being barrier is just quite low. So you don't have to micro too much about them, which I feel is odd, but it's probably more balanced this way. If you have a high barrier on a very mobile unit, you can very easily micro them in and out of combat, recover while you kite, and then come back and fight with this buffer health that's going to be free health. In this case, because it's lower, you kind of can't get away with sustaining damage when you charge in and then charge out. So I think it's fair, but it doesn't play to your advantage, and it does take slightly more micro to get more value out of them. Of course, they can also land if you wish, and they would kind of just hover at ground level because it doesn't make sense for these little discs to be like completely on the ground. Staying in the air, for a ranged chariot option, we have the Burning Chariot of Tzeentch for 1700 costs. And this is really a combination of two units, the Screamers here and the Flamers. And he's now on a bigger disc with a couple spell books around him. In terms of stat, we have the same low barrier count, but relative to the health is actually slightly better here because you have lower health here. You don't have much armor, you're pretty fragile. Leadership is also pretty low. Decent speed, 85. Because you have pretty big mass here on the chariot, 2,800. You are a single entity. Now you do have a special thing on your attacks. You have Warp Flame, which will debuff enemies by removing 15 points of armor. And you also increase any weakness to fire damage by 11%. All your attacks are still considered flaming attacks, and they're also magical attacks. And you have a very high weapon strength. So it's going to be 115, 265 with most of the damage armor piercing, which is rare. And combined with the fact that you can strip away more armor to help your other units so far, which mostly have base damage, this is going to be a pretty decent combo here. You do still have a range component from your Flamer, and the damage is pretty good. It's going to be explosive damage, so the number is going to look a bit interesting. They're going to fire volleys of 9 shots, which is why the 1.4k number looks so big. Most of the damage is going to be armor piercing, plus the splash, plus the Warp Flame ability effect, and still consider a flaming attack. So it's pretty decent all around. Reload time is pretty short, basically multiple volleys of what you expect from Flamers and Pink Horrors, essentially, visually, and they will splash onto your enemy. Then in terms of passive abilities, this unit is considered a siege attacker. It can fire while moving, it's a demon unit, it flies, and because it's a single entity, it has the wounds passive ability, which means once it drops below 25% health, it will lose 20% weapon damage and 10% speed. But note here that single entity range units, such as this, doesn't actually suffer very much range damage loss. It's going to be mostly on the melee component. It still has the 20% physical resistance for being a demon unit for Tzeentch. Aside from that, nothing really much to talk about here. He can also land. This will float a little and the Screamers kind of hover or even fade into the ground if the terrain is kind of low here. But anyhow, pretty interesting unit. Then moving on to regular monsters, we start with the cheap end. Here we have the Chaos Furies, which are only going to cost us 550. They're your basic flying melee infantry, or rather kind of flying shock units with very high speed of 110, not much defensive stats, mainly focus on attack and chase down. Magic damage, consider a demon unit, so they're going to get banish and instability. Same 20% physical resistance for being a demon unit for the Tzeentch roster. Vanguard deployment causes fear, can fly, can land. Pretty standard across the board. In terms of their barrier, it's going to be low again, and the reason is they're very mobile. I think that's usually the trend here for the Tzeentch roster. If you have the ability to pull out of combat pretty easily and kite, they will lower your barrier to prevent any sort of shenanigans where you just kite in for a charge, move back, and wait for the barrier to get back, and rinse and repeat. And you are pretty small, 40 units per retinue with only 150 mass, so really just a light cavalry treatment for these in the air for chase down effects. They're not going to be very good in sustained combat due to their low defensive stats, and very low leadership. Being a demon unit, that's going to be pretty fragile as well. And continue with Tzeentch superior air domination, we have the Screamers, which we've seen pulling the Chariot a bit earlier on, and these Screamers of Tzeentch will cost us 700. So they will have decent speed of 85, also pretty low defensive stats. Their main specialty is their anti-large, which is not a very common trait for Tzeentch rosters. They're going to have a 20-40 weapon split with mainly armor piercing damage and a bonus of 25 points against large, which is kind of their specialty here. They're only 16 per retinue, but they actually have decent mass despite their appearance, 700. And in terms of barrier, once again, because you're flying mobile units, we're only going to get 600. But because of the low health, the ratio is actually slightly better than what we had earlier with Chaos Furies, but still, the barrier number is just a tad low here. And mainly you're going to use these as anti-large flying units to take down perhaps like single entity air enemies, such as the Sky Junks, which I think are considered large units, and these would be fairly effective against them. They are a demon unit, they can fly, Vanguard deploy, cause fear, same physical resistance for being a demon unit in the Tzeentch roster. Finally, returning to the ground, we have the Spawn of Tzeentch costing a 1000. So these are monstrous infantry, and there's a spawn for each of the Chaos Gods, and they're all unbreakable, and there's no difference here for the Tzeentch unit here. Low armor, most of the spawns are glass cannon builds. We have 1000 barrier, that's decent. We don't have a lot of speed. The cool thing about Tzeentch spawn is that they have thundered armor as one of their effects for their attacks, which will rip enemy armor by 30 points. Their weapon strength is pretty standard among all the spawns, 90-40 split, most of it base, and with the thunder armor plus the warp flame, there's actually a way to, rip away 45 armor points against most enemies when playing as Tzeentch, which will help most of your high base damage units to dish out damage. In terms of abilities, aside from Unbreakable and Cause Fear, we are also considered Siege Attacker. Mass-wise, 1,500 for a 16 unit per retinue type of setup here. Pretty decent. Big warrior here. Then at 1,700 cost, we have the basic version of Lord of Change. So obviously, Cairo's Fate Weaver is a special Lord of Change, and there's going to be Exalted Lord of Change that can lead armies as lords. But for the units, there's also the regular Lord of Change, and these are spell casting flying monsters. They can go into the air, but we're going to keep them on the ground here visually. 30 armor, pretty decent average stat here. 70 leadership, decent speed of 90. Melee attack's okay, it's magic. Strength is 420, which is mostly armor piercing, surprisingly. 125, 295. They have a lot of abilities, including a couple of spells. So Tzeentch is pretty well known for being magic users, and they have 2 damage spell here. The Pink Fire of Tzeentch. This is kind of a cone shape or tier shape attack that you can launch, and not only does it do damage, it applies Warp Flame. There is a pretty short range of 100 meters, and the cooldown is going to be 30 seconds, pretty quick there. And then we also have the Blue Fire of Tzeentch. This is going to have an even shorter cooldown with slightly longer range, but instead of being a tier shape, it's just going to be a circular attack targeting a unit, so it's not targeting ground, and it's better against single large combatants because of that, because you can't only target a unit rather than clusters of multiple infantry groups that's kind of stuck together, because you have to target the unit itself, and you'll have the circle kind of around the central unit. Basically bombardment of magical missiles, and it will also apply Warp Flame. Aside from that, it is considered a siege attacker, causes fear and terror. It is a demon unit. It can fly, single entity, thus it has wounds, which will drop its physical damage here. Not physical damage, but just the melee damage, and it only has melee damage, so it's going to hurt it quite a bit, and 10% speed once it dips below 25% health. And we have Fire of Change, which is a special ward save for the entire map whenever this unit is casting. This is actually pretty good. Basically, you want to spam spells, and when you're casting, all your units will receive 11% damage resistance for 9 seconds. That's pretty lovely, actually. And because it's a demon unit, it will pick up the 20% physical resistance as well. In terms of barrier stats here, we're looking at 800. It's not very high because it's pretty mobile. And mass is pretty high, actually. 3,500 for a single entity here. Pretty strong unit, but not the most expensive. Then as we round out the roster, we have the Missile Monster and Beast, starting with the Flamers of Tzeentch at 850. And we kind of seen these units earlier on the Burning Chariot, and they basically are mainly focused on range as a monstrous missile infantry. 10 ammo here, flaming, plus the magic damage. Only 90 range, which is pretty common for most Tzeentch units. There's a couple with 130, but most of their range is restricted to about 90, so they're tend to be a little bit short range. Missile strength is pretty good. It's the same 9 volley that we saw earlier on the Chariot, as I mentioned, but here you get 12 units per retinue, which is good, and because they're monstrous infantry, they have a decent amount of mass at 700. They are not good in melee, but they're not terrible. We have 1234 for the weapon strength. Most of it is armor piercing. Their basic melee attack will also bring warp fire as well, which will help reduce enemy armor, as mentioned earlier. They are pretty fragile themselves, mainly going to be blast cannon spellcasting range unit. In terms of their barrier, 750, which is interesting. It's on the low end. The health is even on the low end. They're just supposed to be glass cannon units that can dish out damage with their spell. Speed is okay actually at a 50. They float, but they don't fly. And they cause fear. They're demons, thus getting the 20% physical resistance. Now, if we move up the price to 1100, we end up with the Exalted Flamers of Tzeentch, which is the exact unit on that Chariot, with the exact same range setup. So the same range damage and range as the Flaming Chariot we seen earlier. It has 10 ammo, weapon strength for the units as a melee component goes way up because you only get one of these become single entity, and most of the damage is still armor piercing, and we have the same warp fire on the melee as well. Leadership is okay, same speed setup, same health setup as well, and as a single entity we have slightly higher mass at 1400. Now in terms of abilities, we have the same setup except for wounds, which is a punishment for our melee side of things if we dip below 25% health. And you can just think of these as non-flying versions of the Chariot unit with slightly less charging capabilities, but the range side of things are pretty much the same. And finally, for the most expensive option in the Tzeentch roster, and most rosters of the Chaos God, we have a Soul Grinder. And this is the Tzeentch version of the Soul Grinder, which pretty much is the same as every version of the Soul Grinder. We have a missile component that shoots out different amount of volleys per shot. In this case, we shoot out 5, which lifts our damage a little bit higher. We have a bonus against large with our missile. So there are small differences in terms of what they're capable of, but in this case we have another bit of anti-large in the Tzeentch roster. Missile damage is mainly armor piercing as well. The reload time is 10.8, which is a bit high for the Tzeentch roster, but it matches up with pretty much all the reload time of the Soul Grinder units, so no differences there. 10 ammo, good range of 250. Their melee component is pretty good as well, with 450 melee attack, and it's going to be the 135 315 split, which I believe is the same for all Soul Grinders. Good magic attack on that melee attack stat. 90 armor, it will cause terror, and mainly the barrier here is actually not bad. 800 for a unit that is pretty fast at 75, and it has a decent mass of 4,000, probably the highest mass we've seen here for the Tzeentch roster. The Lord of Change only has 3,500. Now, as a single entity, our issues once again going to be wounds, and we will cause fear and terror. We'll count as a siege attacker, and because we're a demon, we'll still get that 20% physical resistance. So that's going to do it for the entire Tzeentch roster. There are only 14 units, and you might notice the Tzeentch playstyle is mainly focused on harassment in general because of the barrier mechanic and their focus on spell casting and range and flying units. A lot of very fast unit as well, so the entire mechanic is trying to micro well to use your barrier, and that's going to be a pretty challenging factor for most new players, as the micro requirement for Tzeentch is probably the highest in the game in my opinion, and without any pure raw defensive stats to bolster most of their units, you're going to have to try to make the best out of the barrier mechanic to try to keep your units alive so that they can dish out more spells, they can do more damage. Their army ability is all based on spell casting as well, so it's going to be a lot of really good spell spamming, and that's actually pretty strong. So hopefully you enjoyed this unit roster overview, and if you're interested in seeing other unit roster overviews for all the factions, definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as I'll be making these faction previews and unit roster overviews, as well as guides covering Total War Warhammer 3 throughout the pre-release period leading up to the launch of the game. So thanks again for watching till the end, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!